and welcome to the 2021 CMHO Virtual Conference. My name is Sanjani and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Children's Mental Health Ontario, and I'm very excited to introduce today's session, FASD and Mental Health, a fireside chat with providers and people with lived experience. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that we are joining from across Ontario from Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. We recognize that Indigenous practices of health and well-being have been in place in this territory for over 10,000 years and are maintained to this day. As healthcare leaders, we have much work to do ourselves to do our part and support the decolonization of children's healthcare systems. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to share that in fact, this is our last session for the 2021 CMHO Virtual Conference. And all of our sessions to date have really focused on a central theme around how do we reimagine better care for children and youth with mental health needs. Today's conference session will follow in a similar vein as we aim to reimagine better care for FASD and mental health. And we are absolutely grateful for the generous support of our conference sponsor, the Knowledge Institute on Child and Youth Mental Health and Addictions. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers for today's session, and I'll begin with Nancy Lockwood, who is moderating our discussion for today. Nancy is an FASD consultant and educator with over 25 years of work and lived experience supporting individuals of all ages with FASD. Her current focus is on building capacity at provincial agencies to increase their ability to support the FASD community. Previously, Nancy managed Able2's fetal alcohol resource program. We also have three panelists for today's session: Janet Carioni, Angela Geddes, and Renier DeSmit. Janet Carioni is the occupational therapist with the Catholic District School Board of Eastern Ontario, where she provides assessment and intervention for students with complex needs. Janet's clinical interests include the neurobiology of prenatal and childhood trauma. She has worked on multidisciplinary FASD assessment teams and was a founding member of the Fetal Alcohol Resource Program in Ottawa. Angela is a social worker with over 25 years of experience supporting individuals and families with complicated mental health and learning challenges in a variety of settings. She has a particular interest in FASD and has continued her research, both formal and informal, dedicated to understanding what FASD looks like across the lifespan and across sectors from the family and frontline perspective. She recently authored a book titled A Complicated and Beautiful Brain, which I'm sure she will share more about today. And last but not least, we have Renier DeSmit. Very early on in his life, Renier felt something was wrong with himself. For as long as he could remember, he felt different from other folks, and others constantly reinforced that message to him over the next 50 plus years. Then, at 56 years old, Renier received a diagnosis that he was on the FASD spectrum. This information would set him free to finally find and be his authentic self. He now advocates for those on the FASD spectrum and shares his learned life experiences to help all others understand what it can feel like being inside the spectrum. Together, all our panelists are going to lead us through a really engaging presentation, an excellent discussion, all to be followed by some dedicated opportunity for Q&A. I do want to note that this session is being recorded, and both the recording and the slide deck will be shared with you after the conference wraps up. I also want to highlight that all our panelists today will be sharing a number of resources, and all of the links to those resources are actually included in the slide deck, which you'll receive after the session. And without further ado, I welcome Nancy to get us started.
Thank you, Sandini. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're here with us today. My colleague Janet Carioni is just loading the slide deck. She and I are going to give a brief presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research related to FASD and mental health. She's going to talk about the assessment process for FASD, and then we're going to turn off the PowerPoint, sit back and have what I think is going to be a really interesting discussion. So next slide, please, Janet. I think the best place to start is really just talking about prevalence of FASD in Canada, so we can understand why we need to be talking about this. We're very lucky here in Canada to have a national research network, CanFASD, the Canada FASD Research Network, which is the gathering place for all the best evidence-based research. They have come up with a prevalence number for FASD based on a couple of different studies. And the number that they use for prevalence is 4%. 4% of Canadians are estimated to have FASD. Now, I just want to mention many of those people are undiagnosed. They may have been misdiagnosed with things like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, reactive attachment disorder, things like that. We also know it's a conservative estimate. They've been doing a lot of prevalence studies in the United States. In fact, one was just published recently by Philip May and his colleagues, and they found prevalence in southeastern US of 7%. They tested a sample of children in grade 1, and they've been doing prevalence studies across the states, and they're finding that sort of range of prevalence. So 4% is probably very conservative. But even taking that 4% prevalence rate, that means compared to other disabilities, FASD is at least 2.5 times more common than autism spectrum disorder, 19 times more common than cerebral palsy, 28 times more common than Down syndrome, and 40 times more common than Tourette's. And yet we don't talk about it much. And a lot of that is because of stigma, which we will get to in our fireside chat. Next slide, please, Janet. Also, if we start looking in certain special populations, we find even higher rates. So researchers found rates of 10 to 40 times higher when they looked in special education settings, correctional facilities, among children in care, in Indigenous populations for really complex reasons, and in specialized clinical settings like services for people with developmental disabilities and psychiatry. Next slide. And I know many of you are supporting children and youth, and many may have been involved in Canada's child welfare system. If we do a bit more of a deep dive into that, we know that conservative estimates indicate that 3 to 11% of children and youth in care have FASD. Again, many may be undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. We also know that they experience more abuse and neglect than other children. But on a more hopeful note, we know that there are things that we can do to improve outcomes. And those include diagnosis, which is why we're going to be talking about that today, interventions, building on somebody's strengths in order to compensate for some of the challenges they may be having. And also, it's a really key thing to be offering support to caregivers. Next slide, please. And then if we look at the research related to FASD and mental health, we see even more why we need to be having this discussion today. So according to the research done by CanFASD, over 90% of people with FASD will experience mental health issues over their lifetime. So just think about that for a minute. 4% of the population is estimated to have FASD, and over 90% of those people will experience mental health issues. We need to make sure we're equipped to address that. We know also that people with FASD are 20 times more likely to have substance use problems. We know from research that children and youth with FASD and or prenatal alcohol exposure experience high rates of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, with the most common ACEs being disruptions in their caregiving situation and exposure to substance use and mental health issues in the home. So it's not just what happened prenatally, but that also interacts with their postnatal environment. So we need to be looking at both of these things. Next slide, please. And the last thing that I want to touch on is to make sure that everybody is aware that we now have the world's first psychotropic medication algorithm for FASD. We know that it can be really tricky diagnosing medications for people with FASD. They often get a lot of side effects. The medications may work differently. They may need different dosing requirements. So Dr. Mansfield-Mella and his team have developed this algorithm, and they've taken the common symptoms that physicians may be seeing, and they've divided them into 4 clusters. And then they've made recommendations, always starting with a non-pharmacological intervention. And if that's not working, then some other first line or second line suggested medications. But we've given you the link. If you're a caregiver, you may want to print this and give it to your child or youth physician. If you are a physician, this algorithm is not in its final form. The people doing the research want to hear from you and get some feedback as to whether you think that it's working. But at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Janet, who's going to talk to you about FASD and the diagnostic process. Janet.
Thank you, Nancy. Go. Just make sure that I'm on. So as Nancy mentioned, my name is Janet Carioni, and I'm just going to give us a very high level overview of just the diagnostic piece around FASD. This is a story of my family. Recently here in Ottawa, where I live, the Children's Hospital just recently launched their first multidisciplinary FASD assessment clinic. And so my family was asked to be part of the story and to share our journey when it comes to receiving an FASD diagnosis. And when we get to the fireside chat, I'll share more about our story specifically. But so back in March of this year, the Ontario government made an announcement that they were going to be investing $2.8 million to expand the FASD diagnostic service capacity within our province of Ontario by funding 12 new FASD clinics for a total of 21 federally funded FASD diagnostic clinics across our province. And when we talk about FASD and the diagnosis, there's a lot of discussion around the stigma, and absolutely the stigma is still there. And, again, I will hopefully be able to share some of that with you during the fireside chat, but this is a quote from CJ Lutke. She is one of the great voices, Canadian voices, self-advocates who really speaks out about FASD. And this is a keynote address that she wrote and delivered together with the FASD changemakers at a summit. So I'll read it for you. Diagnosis is, believe it or not, a gift to those of us lucky enough to actually have that diagnosis, and one that each of us will grow to understand and incorporate as only one part of ourselves, provided we have the right support and acceptance. It will not define us, it will guide us. So here in Canada, we do have guidelines. You may be familiar with them. You may have heard about the Canadian guidelines. The first set was published in 2005, and then in 2016, updated guidelines were published, incorporating the newest research that we had that was available at that time. And really to look at a diagnosis of FASD here within our Canadian context, looking at, the first step is that confirmation of prenatal alcohol exposure. And there are definitely some complications around getting that confirmation. And we'll have, again, opportunities to connect about that later in the fireside chat. Another piece when it comes to the guidelines for diagnosing FASD is looking at the 10 brain domains that are listed here around your screen. And within those 10 brain domains, having a minimum of 3 areas that have been impacted and show evidence of impairment. And that's through assessment. And speaking of assessment, ideally, when we look around the screen and you see those various different brain domains, this is not an area that one professional, one discipline is able to assess on their own to grasp that full picture of someone with prenatal exposure to alcohol and those level of impairments. So really this assessment does need to be done through a multidisciplinary approach. And let's look at those 10 brain domains individually. The first one looking at motor skills, right? And this is the area where, as an occupational therapist, that I can contribute to the assessment process. But we're looking at things like fine motor, gross motor difficulties with, graphomotor, being able to hold your pencil and get your thoughts down on paper, that visual motor integration, tone, various different tones. Often what we see with that prenatal exposure to alcohol is individuals holding on to some of those primitive reflexes much longer. difficulties with balance, whether it be static balance or dynamic balance, challenges around coordination, and also differences in strength in those abilities there. And then the next area when we're looking at assessing for FASD is the area of neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. And there are sometimes you'll see structural abnormalities may exist. And so things like seizures may exist. Often families will ask me whether or not they should go for an MRI and have an MRI done. Now, MRIs are really more of a research tool. They are not a diagnostic tool. They're not going to give us the information that, say, parents are looking for when they're asking about an MRI. And there's some really neat research happening here within our Canadian borders, just looking at the impact of the actual structural integrity of the brain with that prenatal exposure to alcohol. One of the labs that I do want to highlight for you guys is out of the University of Calgary, led by Dr. Catherine Labelle. And the link to her work is available on the slide when you'll get that. Sleep is a big area when we talk about the impact of the neuroanatomy and then looking at it from functionally. When I worked at an FASD assessment clinic, without a doubt, every family who came through the doors spoke to us about the challenges of sleep. And now that I am a clinician working with the school age population, again, talking about sleep challenges and difficulties is a big thing that parents will mention. Because we know that the hypothalamus, that part of our brain that is responsible for our sleep cycles, is really sensitive to that impact from that prenatal exposure to alcohol. So what you will often see are delayed sleep onset, taking a long time to fall asleep, abnormal melatonin secretion, more phase shifts, and that fragmentation of sleep cycles. I remember the doctor at the sleep lab describing my oldest son's test results, saying this is the most fragmented sleep pattern I've ever seen in my career. And I'm amazed that he's awake and sitting in my clinic right now. Like, that's what our young people with FASD, many of them are struggling with. There are more phase shifts from that normal sleep architecture that we expect to see. There's poor sleep quality and shorter sleep duration. So when you put all that together, right, what does that fatigue look like in our children with FASD? This comes out of the work of Dr. Anna Hanlon-Dearman, but these are our young people who are fatigued, may become more hyperactive, increased sensory symptoms, may become more disorganized. Previous behavioral strategies just aren't working anymore. And these young people may become more aggressive when they're fatigued. So that's looking at the area, the second brain domain. And let's look at the third brain domain area of cognition. Right, and this is where we're looking at the verbal abilities and nonverbal, that ability to fluid reason, right? That creative problem solving, thinking outside the box, being able to reframe a situation. All of those pieces really may be impacted and impaired as well for someone with prenatal exposure to alcohol. And just to, really understand why those cognitive abilities may be reduced, there are two types of brain damage that occur with that prenatal exposure to alcohol. One is those brain cells do not develop, right? And so we get those gaps early on in the developmental stages, and further brain development occurs on top of those areas of gap. And what I think of is when I'm rolling the rug or rolling a sleeping bag or the blanket on top of the pool, when you sort of don't line it up perfectly at the beginning, things sort of unravel and you've got one side rolled up tighter than the other. That's when you think about those early brain cells that didn't develop. And then another way of looking at how our cognitive abilities are impacted is looking at neural networks that are connected to the wrong neural networks. So again, thinking of, when you enter those rooms that have a variety of lights, and depending on what switch you turn on, different lights turn on. That's what I think about those neural networks that get connected in the wrong way. If I'm turning on a light switch here in the room and light switches in another room turn on, that's the way I think about it when it comes to those neural networks, the wires getting crossed. And both of those lead to reduced cognitive abilities. Now let's look at the fourth domain, is language. And this is, the wheelhouse of our speech language pathologists, right? But really looking at the expressive language, the receptive language, and the individual's ability to articulate as well. And one of the speech language pathologists that I had the privilege to work with, she used to describe it as a thin veneer of competence. That a lot of times individuals with FASD, when I think of my oldest son as well, like loves to talk and have conversations, and you would never imagine that he really does struggle with his language around the receptive and expressive language as well. And moving on to the next brain domain is academic achievement, right? Looking at those areas of reading development, math, and written expression. For many of our children, especially with the population that I'm working right now in the school system, academic achievement is often an area of difficulty. And then looking at the next brain domain of memory, right? The verbal memory, visual memory. And one of the things that I do want to highlight when we look at the 10 brain domains, when we think of the diagnostic guidelines, it's a minimum of 3 areas impairment. You're going to have individuals with that prenatal exposure to alcohol where there are areas of their memory or other areas that we're talking about today that you don't see any level of impairment. And again, this is, as a parent raising 2 boys with FASD, I see such a difference between my 2 boys when it comes to their memory abilities. And the next area is attention, and looking at sustained attention, selective attention, that ability to resist distractions. And this is where Nancy mentioned earlier about often FASD may be misdiagnosed as ADHD early on in life, especially if the presenting clinical difficulties are sustained attention, selective attention, and resistance to distractions. But the question isn't asked about prenatal history, and it's unknown or, when that's not considered when we're thinking about those functional challenges that the individual is having around attention. And then the next area is looking at executive functioning, and this also includes that impulse control, but looking at areas of working memory, that inhibition, to be able to stop yourself from being impulsive, planning, problem solving, being able to shift my attention from one thing to the next, so perseverating and getting stuck, and that ability to be cognitively flexible. This is another area of a possible impairment for folks with FASD. And then the 9th domain, and I do want to spend time just highlighting in this, and affect regulation is the new domain that was added in 2016. Historically, when we talked about FASD, there was the idea that there were primary disabilities and secondary disabilities, and the secondary disabilities happened because the primary needs and challenges were not met and not supported well, and secondary disabilities occurred. But and those mental health elements used to fall under the secondary disabilities. But what we understand so much better now through the science and research is that because of that prenatal exposure to alcohol and the changes to the brain, that the affect regulation is part of the impairment of the brain, as opposed to being a secondary impact of that prenatal exposure to alcohol. So really looking at the affect regulation and meeting the DSM-5 criteria for various mood-related disorders. And then looking at FASD and mental health more holistically, there's definitely a vast amount of research that's showing us and revealing to us that a lot of those oppositional behaviors that we see with individuals with FASD, that those irritability, the explosiveness, what they're finding is that these are rooted in the mental health of not only the child, but also the family, and looking at that ACE information as well that Nancy touched on briefly. And there's studies that are pointing to looking at anxiety and depression and stress with individuals with FASD as those underpinnings of the meltdowns and the outbursts and the defiance that we do see. So really looking at the ability to regulate our emotions. And Dr. Kim Hellemans, she's now with Carleton University out of the Department of Neuroscience, but looking at the cortisol level. We know that there's a natural cortisol, effect that happens throughout our day, depending on what's going on and what the expectations are in our life. But what the research has found is that individuals with FASD, their baseline cortisol level it starts off that much higher, their stress hormone. And so with that, there's a greater reactivity when exposed to a stressful situation and a delayed recovery. And the work around cortisol level and the response to stress is quite fascinating to look at. And I encourage you to read some of the work. There's some newer research that has come out as well. And then, as an OT, I worry about the sensory system, and this is something that I look at. We know through the research that the sensory channels are impacted with that prenatal exposure to alcohol in the developmental phase. So they often develop without filters, right? So that's the ability to, right now I am feeling the tag on the back of my shirt, but I can put that back. I can filter that out and focus on what I'm doing right now. But when you don't have filters, everything's coming at you at the exact same intensity. You don't know where you need to put your attention, especially in the classroom, listening to the teacher, but you have a million other sounds coming at you. How do you know which one is the sound you need to pay attention to? With that prenatal exposure to alcohol, the sensory processing is altered. Our ability to process that information that comes in from our environment. And also there's just that the deficit occurs as well. Just overall, we know that prenatal exposure to alcohol impacts the development of our sensory system. And we also know that there's difficulty with regulating our behavior, right? And this is a direct quote out of Dr. Chesnoff's book, Guided Growth, but difficulties with behavioral regulation frequently are expressed through impulsivity. And children and adolescents with FASD are often perceived as breaking rules, cheating, fibbing, and stealing. However, this most often is due to an inability to regulate their behaviors and inhibit their impulses rather than having a conduct disorder. Misdiagnoses such as attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder also frequently applied to young people affected by prenatal exposure to alcohol, although such difficulties are related to problems in shifting attention and sustaining the mental effort required in order to complete tasks. So again, let's look at the symptomatology of prenatal exposure to alcohol and FASD as opposed to, just let's look at it again when we think about the impact it has on that developing brain. And the last area in the brain domains when we look at an FASD diagnosis is assessing around adaptive behavior, social skills, or social communication, right? Looking at the things like life skills and the increased social vulnerability, the social language, the social communication skills, the pragmatic language skills, all these pieces may also be impacted by that prenatal exposure to alcohol. And where I'm going to sort of wrap us up is we have those 10 brain domains that we look at when doing an assessment and considering the impact of that prenatal exposure to alcohol on the individual. But there are some subtle challenges that don't neatly fit into those 10 brain domains, right? But difficulties learning from consequences, verbal processing difficulties, having a slower processing speed, a memory that's inconsistent, cognitive fatigue from all the hard brain work that our young people are doing, those dysfunctional sleep patterns, poor grasp of abstract ideas, navigating social interactions, and impulsivity. I just focused on a lot of the difficulties and challenges that individuals with FASD experience, but we're going to move into a time where we're going to shift into hearing the positive stories and the strengths and the beauty of FASD as well.
Well, thank you, Janet. And that was really interesting and helpful. And at this point, we're going to take down the PowerPoint, and I'd invite all the panelists to turn on your cameras. We're just going to have more of a relaxed chat at this point. So you've already met Janet. Now you can meet Angela Geddes and Rainier DeSmit. I'm going to be the moderator. So we have some questions that we want to discuss. And then at the end of that, we're going to be addressing some of the questions that you have provided. And everybody here has some level of expertise, but I really want to say the true expert that you're looking at is Rainier. I want to thank you so much for sharing your story, your experiences, and we need to always remember that people with FASD are the true experts, and we need to listen and learn. So I always learn so much when I hear you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you.
And I'm going to give you the first question. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a bit about your journey to getting a diagnosis of FASD. We heard that you were 56. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I'll give you the Reader's Digest summarized because I can certainly expand on the story, but I'm going to keep it concise. I didn't think about this question, but I'm wearing the Queen's Neuroscience sweater I got back when I first realized that FASD even existed. I have a video production company is one of the things I do, and an associate of mine, Sue Kobus, was producing a bunch of videos for the neuroscience department. And I was editing these videos on FASD, and it was like the weirdest thing because I'm editing like my own life. And as you'll probably hear a little bit later, lots of therapy over my lifetime. And I'm like going, oh my gosh, this is everything I've gone through. Right. So in a nutshell, that's kind of at that point, that led to quite a multiple year process of finally getting around to a diagnosis that kind of was an important point in my life.
And how did you feel when you got your diagnosis?
It was a massive relief. It was a relief for myself. It explained why, half of the therapy I did, and I worked really hard at it, why it never worked. There was a lot of failure feelings, a lot of I just can't do it right feelings that evaporated almost immediately because it kind of told me, well, yeah, you're not wired to do that right. It's again back to something in Janet's slides about the miswiring. You think you're throwing the light switch for the living room, but instead the heater in the bedroom goes on. And it's like, what? I didn't know that was happening, and everybody's saying, "Turn on the light in the bedroom." I'm going, I am. It's not. So to find out, well, no, now all you got to do is hit that switch, and that'll make that go. It's like, So it was a major relief. Also, just as a sidebar, major relief to my parents to go, to go. This is why all their attempts at loving discipline and sometimes maybe less than loving just never would have worked. But now I understood, and that helped a lot of healing in my family.
Can you even tell a bit about the videos that you did for NeuroDevNet, now known as Kids Brain Health Network?
Right. Yeah, it was. I guess what happened was, so I've been editing these videos with Sue Kobus there for a couple years. I met some really amazing people, and when this kind of came out, she kind of elbowed me and said, "Ha ha ha. You better do one now." And it was like, ugh. So I got to get on the other side of the camera. I was really blessed to have a mother who, though a really rough, maybe first 40, 50 years of our lives, we'd sorted out a lot of things. And when she heard about the diagnosis and we talked it through, she realized how important this was for other parents. I just feel so happy when I hear Janet talk to know that her two boys, it just touches my heart to know that they've got that, to save them perhaps a bunch of real bumpy, grinding stuff that me and my parents went through. So my mom was enthusiastic to do what she could. As much as she's terrified of cameras, she was willing to get in front and speak her truth. So in that, I also feel very blessed and proud of her.
The videos are wonderful, and when you get your package with the slides, you'll have a link so that you can watch them if you haven't seen them. I highly recommend it. I'm going to just one more quick part of that question. Do you think it would have made your life any different if you'd had your diagnosis earlier?
Ooh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'll be very blunt. I don't know. I'm not going to say it would have been positive. Everything would have been awesome. It would have. I would. It's funny. My life partner and I, my significant other, we've talked about that actually recently, and it's amazing. She says, you're awesome the way you are, and that sinks in sometimes that I think I'm a pretty good guy, and I don't know. I just don't know. What roots would have had, I would have suffered very differently if there's suffering in general. As the Buddhists say, there's life is suffering. I think my suffering would have been a different whole package, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But it would have absolutely, I think there would have been more peace for everybody involved. There would have been more clarity of, the hard work would have been clear about what the hard work was. We weren't just digging in the dirt, not knowing what was in there. We would have known there were gems buried in there, and we would have all probably grabbed that shovel with more enthusiasm and would have swung it at each other's heads quite as often, I suspect. So,
thank you for sharing that. Thanks so much. I'm going to move on to you, Angela. I'm wondering, as someone who works in the mental health field, if you could talk about what you see as the importance of getting a diagnosis if there's suspicion that somebody has FASD, and why is it so important to get the right diagnosis?
Sure, although I think Rainier is a hard act to follow because he did quite a bit around some of that. But I have been in this field for over 25 years, and it's really interesting because the very first little person that I ever met had fetal alcohol syndrome. So we don't use that diagnosis anymore, but it was reflective of those who have all of the facial features, and this little fellow was pretty medically fragile. So, the bad news was that he was exposed to a lot of alcohol, but the good news was that he was exposed to a lot of alcohol in the sense that everybody saw what his needs were. So I think that, when I fast forward through the next 10 years of my career, I was imprinted very early around the implications of alcohol use, but I really didn't know. Like, I thought it took a lot more alcohol, right? So there was a 10-year span where I was supporting individuals who were coming to me for mental health and educational support that I wasn't seeing clearly. So to me, a diagnosis is a pathway to relevant and helpful services. And it does provide that clarity, as Rainier mentioned, and it's really interesting because I've also had the honor of coordinating an assessment clinic. And, all of us were a little bit worried around the first biological family that came into play because we were, how is this going to come down with, there's a teenager now who learns that alcohol was a part of his history, right? That's resulted in some of these challenges. But it was the most beautiful, it gives me goosebumps and it brings me to tears to this day because it was very similar. It was like this weight you could visually see it lift off of the shoulders. And the young fella said to his mom, "See, I'm not lazy." And the mom said, "See, I'm not a bad parent." And I think that just really summed it up. Now, were there moments of grief, and was it beautiful and, the Cleaver family after that? Probably not, right? But there was at least that understanding that if we adjust our expectations, if we, create environments that can make people shine and thrive and, really focus on their strengths. And so that's another thing. I think that a full diagnosis allows, or a full assessment, and the comprehensive assessment like Janet described earlier, allows us to really look at those strengths. So sure, we recognize some of the difficulties that are there and the challenges, but we can focus on the strengths and mitigate some of the risks for people so that their path is a little bit
And what do you see as the danger if, for instance, they were given a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder by mistake, or even we've heard sometimes it's been given thinking that it might give the family more access to more support? Is there a risk?
Well, I think that there is a risk of not being understood for sure. I can speak to that where there's been the diagnosis of autism, and you can have them concurrently as well.
Yes.
But I have seen it in situations where we've left that diagnosis because that is where the services are more apt to be sought, and available to families. So and some of the services are helpful in terms of access to occupational therapy, access to speech and language, and some of those early interventions, but they don't work the same way, just like CBT doesn't work the same way. And Rainier made reference to how many attempts of counseling, and we're looking for outcomes that are not possible in the way that we're delivering the services. So I think that, and I've seen I'm just doing some work right now, and I just recently took a picture of the charts that I reviewed, and I'm not kidding you when I tell you it's this thick, right, of previous assessments, previous and misspent dollars. But I mean, I always focus on the cost to families, because, you know, they're getting multiple assessments done, telling their stories multiple times. And I can tell you, I had one mom that said to me, you know, Ange, if they send me to one more parenting class, I'm going to lose my mind. You know, I do not need to learn all of these parenting strategies. I know them. It's not the same. They're not, it's
Right.
not working for my little person. And my little person has what I refer to as pockets of brilliance.
Mm-hmm.
And I titled my book Complicated and Beautiful Brain, because it is that. Like, there's so much beauty, so much kindness, tolerance, inclusivity, and stick-to-itness and tenacity, like that day after day, willing to go to a place that oftentimes school is not safe. Oftentimes the group and the you know, the groups that we're going to where the therapy is not the safest place, but we go at it again, right? So I just think that you know, multiple misdiagnosis just leads people to believe that there's something wrong with them.
Right.
And I've also saw so many times where parents, unfortunately, believe that they're not the right fit for their child. And so then it complicates it. You know, we assume that a lot of these behaviors are related to environment. And there's a lot of blame and shame on parents for that, for these misbehaviors, right? Where we're not meeting their needs. And so I just feel like, you know, we have to recognize that we as a system can inadvertently cause and perpetuate trauma and a disjointed environment when we don't consider the role of that early brain damage and that early brain trauma as a result of alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Angela. And now, Janet, you are going to talk to us a bit about your own family's journey getting FASD assessments for your boys. And I just want to thank your whole family. I know Janet's family. I know her boys. They're just lovely and wonderful and curious and smart and clever. They're just so great. But I am so grateful to all of you for sharing your story. Do you want to tell us more about it?
Sure. So my journey to an FASD diagnosis for both my boys was different for each of them. So at the time, for my oldest son, I was working at an FASD assessment clinic at that time. And, you know, we were getting ready for him to enter the school for JK, but recognizing that he was starting to have some struggles around like learning colors. And he was already involved at the Children's Treatment Center with OT, PT, and speech language pathology. And each month, as our clinic team sat around discussing the kids who were coming through the FASD assessment clinic, you know, each month I would it started to feel too close to home, right? The things that we were saying about discussing them in our assessment findings and hearing from the other clinicians on the team, it sounded really close to what was happening at home. And so I connected with every single one of my colleagues on the team, right? And I said, this is what I think is going on for my son. We know that he had quite a significant prenatal history, as well as some early life adversity as well before joining our family. So I met with the developmental pediatrician from our team. I brought him all the other assessment reports that my son had already been through. And he confirmed my suspicions that my son indeed met the criteria for a diagnosis of FASD. And fast forward a number of years, you know, our family left that community, moved out to Ottawa, where we are right now. And then my younger son, you know, he was in about grade 2 or so, and just really starting to struggle around impulsivity in the classroom. And the things that the teacher was describing didn't match what we were seeing at home. But I was looking at it more from a trauma lens as well, because I knew that there were some significant things that happened at school, and he had quite significant anxiety about going to school because of some things that had happened to him. So I had, you know, connected with a developmental pediatrician here in our community, because I knew her, and I knew that about her, her level of experience with prenatal exposure to alcohol, and as well as early trauma and life adversities. And when I went to her, in my mind, I was thinking trauma for my son. I wasn't thinking FASD. And as she, we went through his history and the things that he was having difficulty with, she looked at me and said, Janet, you know what this is? I said, yeah, maybe it's like anxiety, or maybe it's, a trauma response to being bullied. And she said, no, it's FASD. And I looked at her and I said, it can't be FASD. It's not FASD. She said, take it away, think about it. And when I went home, and again, here I am, I present about this stuff, I talk about it, and I went and I sat down there with my notes. I'm like, shoot, it is. He has check boxes in 3 of the 10 categories, 10 of the brain domains. And she was right. My pediatrician was right. So that's how it went. But again, it's, I knew who I needed to go to for different assessments. And I know the community and who are informed and aware. Not everyone has that ability. And the launch of some FASD multidisciplinary clinics in Ontario it's going to help alleviate that for families, absolutely. But we also know that not all the communities have that capacity.
Right. And actually, we're going to get to that. But before we do, I'm curious how your boys reacted to getting their diagnoses.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? When your mom talks about it, and this is what her work is. And so my younger son, he had already known mommy works in FASD, and this is in the field that I work in, and he's heard me talk. And then at the time he received his diagnosis, he was in grade 3. It didn't make sense to him. He said, well, that's what my brother has. And he sees the functional differences between the two.
Yeah.
Like now they're in grade 7 and 8. But he can see that, academically, developmentally, cognitively, behaviorally, there's vast differences between my 2 boys. So for my younger son, for many years said, I don't have what he has. The doctor's wrong. But now, they're older and they're really understanding what it means for them. One of the things that absolutely breaks my heart the most, though, for my older son, now he's entering into his teenage years, but it really started this summer, when those behavioral difficulties, those emotional dysregulation moments come into play. And at the end or in the middle, he yells, why do I have to have FASD? Why does this happen to me? And it breaks my heart as his mom, right? I wish, right? Like we talk about, I know this stuff, I talk about this, I support it clinically, but in my home, the reality of it is hard, it is tough. But when I see the good moments, right? In those tough moments, they will say, why do I have to have FASD? And we have those conversations, but at the other end, I did ask their permission to make sure I can do these things, these live talks, because make sure they're okay that I talk about them, that I'm not just talking about my work.
It's a big step for them.
It's a huge step for them.
Yeah, and please thank them from us.
I will.
And I'm going to go back to you for a moment, Angela. Why do you think it's important that we proactively support the mental health of people with FASD as opposed to doing crisis management? Why do we need to be on the lookout for this?
Well, because I think, prevention is just so critical, right? So when we're able to see and support people where they're at and change the expectations and shift the environment, people do better. People are happier and they're more successful and they feel like they belong and they don't have those constant feelings of being that square peg trying to go into a round hole, and just not fitting in to the environment that we have. So I think that, doing whatever we can. And I think that means that as family members and as service providers, I think we have to be creative in our thinking, right? And we have to check our own biases at the door. Like we have to redefine what is good parenting, and what is good behavior. So when people miss appointments, do we assume that they're not ready for treatment yet? do we assume that they're not ready yet? But could we look at that with a broader lens and be a little bit more inclusive? And sometimes that just means subtle shifts, you know, but sometimes it means more profound shifts in our service delivery. But I think it's really important, because when people understand what's going on and the circle around them understand what's going on, then they can be supported. And that external kind of support system can be a best friend, it can be a partner, it can be a family member, it can be a teacher. It doesn't mean that you know, people can't work towards independence or interdependence, right, and be successful. And we can mitigate the risk of something going really badly, you know, and really poorly. So.
Rainier, I'm just wondering if you could talk to us. What are your thoughts on FASD and stigma?
It's interesting for me, being that I've got a good dose of silver in my hair, is, you know, it's such a different question if you could jump in a time machine and go back 20 years ago. I've recently done a bit of research on this topic, and it's interesting that stigma it's just such it's like kind of hatred and things. There's certain things, it's kind of like a learned thing. And at first I thought there's a lot less stigma now. And I think it's just that, I think there's about the same amount of stigma. We just understand it better, and people can make better choices to not embrace it. You know, I think for me, constantly being berated with what the hell's wrong with you, what, you know, why did you do that, what were you thinking, you know, that wasn't even stigma for me. That was just, I was wrong, which is not a stigma. Like, that's judgment, which is which was really interesting, because now I realize people would go, oh, well, they're on a spectrum. Oh, that's too bad they're on that spectrum. That they're like, there's still kind of judgment and stuff. It's a little different angle on the same beast. So I still feel stigma's pretty strong. What I feel hopeful about is that we've moved it out of an accepted way to behave, much like prejudice, racism, all these things. It's still rampant in the world, but there's more and more people going, oh my gosh, it really is a thing. You know, and people are starting to understand, I think, that stigma is, it's a stronger beastie than we thought. You know, I think for a while we thought, well, we'll identify, this is your disorder, this is your disorder, this is your skin color, this is your religious belief. Oh, good, now we'll be accepting. Just understanding that doesn't change the inherent mechanism in people that wants to make it always about us and them. And so for me, stigma is something I'm really paying attention to, how to educate people. It's not so much, you know, that old saying about, you know, around the topic of race, you know, people would say, well, I don't see color. Well, that's kind of dumb. There is different colors. That's what makes pictures beautiful. And, you know, that's a dumb thing. But, you know, to see color and then understand what it really means and what it doesn't really mean. And so I think, example, I don't mind if someone says to me, wow, that's a crazy thing you did, you know, and when someone says, why would you do that? I can hold up my FASD card. You know, I got an explanation now. But that doesn't make the thing I did any smarter or dumber it's just the thing I did, right?
Yes. Do you think that stigma, sorry,
nope.
But I'm going to ask you another question on stigma. Sorry for interrupting. Do you think stigma might be a barrier to people getting the supports they need? Do you think perhaps, so say in the workplace or in school, that coming forward with your diagnosis do you think that some people's worry about stigma might keep them from seeking support?
I absolutely, I do, again, and that's based on the prejudice of their family and of their culture. You know, again, when you're properly educated, if I had been born with a leg missing, you know, for some reason, you know, people would look at me, they would treat me differently. I'm a person with only one leg. But there'd be this kind of acceptance of how do we support this person. There wouldn't be like this, well, gee, I think with mental disorders and stuff, again, culturally, some families, some cultures, it's like, this is a bad thing to have. This is and it's not just that's bad luck. It's like that's a bad thing, and therefore you are now a bad thing. And so I think that being diagnosed some people don't want to be diagnosed. I'd rather be kind of stupid, dumb, and crazy than actually be a normal person on an FASD spectrum, as an example. I also think I have noticed it's one of my big things in my advocacy is also to make sure that I don't know how to call it yet. I almost call it positive stigma, which is, well, I'm on the FASD spectrum, so I get to do shit, and it's funny, kids don't think that way, but I notice this more in any adults when we get into a certain place where it's around victimhood and stuff. So I'm a strong advocate that the stigma can also be used as a tool to put oneself in a victim state, or perhaps even put your kids in a victim state, my poor kids. And I don't want sympathy, and what I want is understanding. So I don't know if any of this is making sense, but I'm going to leave it at that.
No, that's very, very eloquent. Thank you. I also want to address the fact that mental health issues aren't just an issue for people with FASD, but can be for the whole family. So Angela, could you talk about why we need to also guard the mental health of caregivers and siblings in the home?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that as we've discovered, FASD is very puzzling. And some of these, the impulsivity and the sensory outputs and the dysregulation, and lots of times things like, the sensory stuff can just manifest into behaviors that, are hard to understand. And as Janet mentioned earlier, the levels, the hormonal levels and the levels that people are experiencing, like kids with FASD are never, when we say with he went from 0 to 60, well, he's never at 0. Right? They're always at about 30 or 40, and then it just doesn't take long for that reactivity, right? So it's hard to be a parent and a caregiver 24/7, and on top of that, our system isn't really well equipped to offer the supports that these families really need, and so it's not uncommon for me to hear that parents have to explain what FASD. I mean, just as recent as this last week, this person that I support and know, has been back and forth to the hospital a number of times, and you see a number of people, and FASD was written on it, and they literally said, what does the F mean in front of ASD? And it was just so disheartening. Like, and so I just see these parents just heartbroken that when they go to a specialist, they're the ones that have to explain what's happening. So it becomes exhausting. I see, parents have to be advocates, they have to be teachers, they have to be like all of that, and it just becomes really exhausting. And then on top of that, our little people don't sleep that well, which means mommy and daddies don't sleep that well, and none of us are at the top of our game when we're sleepy and sleep deprived and constantly on point. And the behaviors, like I said, they happen very quickly. So siblings can, there's a lot more conflict in the house, I'm hearing. Sometimes there's conflict and aggression towards one another and towards caregivers. And, that's traumatizing. And I mentioned earlier, sometimes parents feel like they're the wrong fit, like just whatever I do is not right. Like it's not working for this little person. This little person needs to be with somebody who can meet their needs better than I can. And to me, that's trauma. That's trauma for the parents. Right. So, and we need to understand that. And I mean, I don't know this to be absolute, but I know that there's a lot of people who foster and adopt with the understanding that they're going to love whatever adverse experience that's been happening in their life out of these children, right? Like we all want that for our children, right? We want to provide that safety and that security. And when babies are not responding to us the way we expect them to, and when, that back and forth isn't happening it's hard on moms and dads too. So there's a grief and loss, and it's not a linear state, right? This is a pathway where, we're talking about lots of lovely moments, and the more we understand, but there's lots of challenging moments, and parents need to take care of themselves, and that doesn't mean a trip to the spa necessarily, but that means meeting their own needs as well.
Yeah. The other thing that I found too is that people with FASD so often reflect the mood of the person that they're with. And so if the caregivers are also exhausted and dysregulated, that's also not going to help. So if we can support the other people in the home as well to be calm and have their cup filled, that can often be helpful as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, siblings too, they do get kind of left out sometimes, right? When there's really high need for anything. We see that with medical needs, we see it with autism, we see it with anything. So it's definitely a consideration. So.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is for both Janet and Angela. I'm going to start with you, Janet. What would you advise for communities that don't have a multidisciplinary diagnostic clinic? When I first met you, when you first moved to Ottawa, you told me about a really creative way they were addressing this in Waterloo. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and I think it really depends on the community. You really have to get a good understanding of what resources and what's available in the community, and the capacity around understanding FASD and why does it matter, right? Like, it's really that big question of why does it matter that we have an accurate diagnosis of FASD, and then building community partners within the community, right? The assessment team that I was part of at that time, there were professionals from around the community who were interested in FASD, and so our time was contributing to an assessment team. Myself as an occupational therapist, and there were psychologists, neuropsychologists, speech language pathologists, pediatricians. We all came from different areas of the community to build a team together. So that's one way that it can be built up in a community.
And similarly,
what about you?
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Angela, how about you? What did you have other ideas?
Yeah, well, similarly, when we were in London, the pilot project is no longer in existence, but it was interesting because we brought as many people in to mentor and to learn from, and then also just to support if there's an assessment that's already underway and we know there's prenatal exposure, then maybe we can augment that existing assessment rather than redo the whole thing or see it through that prenatal alcohol exposure lens. I mean, I think we all need to realize that not everybody who needs a diagnosis is going to get one. I mean, the need far outweighs our current capacity. And even if we did have the money to come up with all of the clinics, we don't have the clinicians. And when you think about it, I mean, it wasn't very long ago, we had 1% of the population that we thought. And at that point, that meant 300,000 people today need a diagnosis. But our capacity, the most recent, when I finished my thesis, which was 2016, but it's still not that much different in terms of how many we across Canada can diagnose. That was only a little over 2,000 a year. So at that rate, it's 170 years, maybe we'll have 1%. Now we have to multiply it by 4 and potentially much higher than that, right? And so. Right.
Oh, thank you. And the next question is on capacity building, but beyond diagnosis. How do you build diagnostic capacity? How do you build capacity to support people with FASD in your community, including mental health providers? So actually, Janet and I are going to answer this one. Janet, I'm hoping you can talk about how we did this when we were at the Fetal Alcohol Resource Program at Able To, and then I've been asked to share a pretty innovative idea from another region in Ontario. Janet,
so
about it?
When Nancy and I first worked together as part of the Fetal Alcohol Resource Program, really what we recognized and identified in the community is there were a lot of services that individuals with FASD and prenatal exposure to alcohol access, but these services that were being accessed really were not FASD aware or recognized that they needed to be FASD aware. So we did really a a big giant blanket scan of the entire community. We reached out to them. Nancy pulled together all the contact information we needed, anything from, you know, like mental health supports to recreational programs, to city-run camps, to private camps, everything, school boards. We reached out to everywhere where individuals with FASD may touch or may access services. And then we did a kind of like a, how much FASD information do you know? And are you interested in learning more? And we developed and provided capacity building training within the community. And that was, my goodness, 5 years ago, over 5 years ago.
Over 6.
Over 6 years ago. So and it's amazing just to see that level of knowledge about FASD and what does FASD Inform mean within that community. I now work for a school board, and that opportunity came from doing one of the FART presentations at a school board. But that's something that I've been doing as well in the last 3 years that I've been there, is building that capacity and that knowledge, and increasing that awareness of, like, we do need to recognize and care about FASD. You know, Rainier gave a great example about that. Well, I don't see the color of your skin. Like, that's an example that I often use, is like, it's obvious I'm Asian, right? But we need to identify and recognize that FASD exists in our communities, and we can't just say, but I treat to the symptom, or I treat to the presentation within my clinical and practice. But unless we really understand the nuances and the intricacies and the complexity of FASD and all that comes together with it, we're not going to be able to support these individuals like to the full capacities to help really bring out their strengths and that beauty that sometimes get hidden under those difficulties and challenges that we say I'm focusing on the difficulty, but you don't pay attention to the FASD. Like, that's important.
Yeah, they're doing something quite similar in another Eastern Ontario region, Lanark, Leeds, Grenville. They have a very proactive FASD group there called the Rural FASD Support Network. And what they've done is they have a social work student from Carleton University doing a placement with them. She started last September. Her name's Brooke Robinson, and I met with her to find out what they're doing. And so what she's doing, it's going to take 8 or 9 months, but she's doing a resource gap analysis of the region. So what she's done is reach out to over 70 organizations, and then she took Can FASD's report toward healthy outcomes. That report breaks all the different organizations that should support people with FASD into these 12 sectors. So what Brooke has done, she's taken these 70 organizations and sort of slotted them into these 12 sectors to see where the gaps are and what sectors are doing well. And then she also reached out to people with FASD and caregivers and asked them, what's working well in your community? What isn't working well? What needs to be fixed or improved? And then she's doing an analysis of this. There will be a report in May, which she's going to then take back to these organizations to sort of show how they could be building capacity in their region, but they're also taking it to the municipality, and then may take it, use it as a way to inform public policy as well. They're going to gather some really helpful information as well that can be used beyond their region. So just another way. I think there's some really creative things. 2 other quick things that communities could do as well. Can FASD has wonderful online courses for different sectors. For instance, they have a wonderful course for educators, one for justice officials, one for people working on teams doing diagnosis. And then Health Nexus, which is a provincial agency funded by Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, just published free service provider training. So that would be of benefit to all sorts of professionals and service providers. It's in 8 units. So those are other things, is just go out into your community and really advocate for people to build up their knowledge. As Janet said, so many agencies should be doing this and could be doing this, but maybe they just didn't have the resources. So we can help with that. So thank you so much for this chat. And at this point, I'm going to invite Sandini to join us. and let us know about some of the questions that you've been receiving from participants.
Great. Thank you all for such an engaging conversation and for also sharing your experiences. I really appreciate that. So as Nancy mentioned, we're going to jump into the Q&A portion of our session. Just as a quick reminder to our audience, there is a Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. So we encourage you to place any questions that you have for any of the speakers within that little Q&A box. You can also take a look at the questions that have already been posted and upvote them as well. And that way we can reserve the Q&A for the questions and the chat for any comments. I will also flag that within the Q&A, there's a neat function that allows you to submit your question anonymously. So we encourage that, especially if you have or are supporting someone with FASD and do not wish to reveal any identifying information. So just wanted to share that quick reminder. And while we wait for some of the questions to start coming in, I did want to kick us off with one question. And this one was actually a question that was submitted in advance. So when we set up the registration, we got a number of our attendees submitting questions, and one big one that came up over and over again, and that many of you have actually touched on, is with respect to caregiver supports. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time here unpacking what some of the key considerations are around caregiver supports, how we account for the mental health of caregivers. And one other area in particular I think we need to maybe talk about is the diversity of caregivers and recognizing, age of the caregiver in question, or even the nature of the relationship. And also then how we cater caregiver supports accordingly. So maybe for this one, Nancy, I'll start with you, just again to hear kind of what comes to mind when you think about caregiver supports, and feel free for the other panelists to jump in as well.
Sure. I think that's a really good question. And I've actually been involved in a lot of caregiver support, including support groups, for over 2 decades. I'm the oldest person here. What I have learned, and sometimes learned the hard way, is that you sometimes have to break down caregiver support by the age of the child or youth or adult that they're supporting. So what I found is when we had caregiver groups that welcomed people of all ages and raising children of all ages, that often the older caregivers did not feel comfortable speaking in front of the younger families because they were worried that they might scare them. That, for instance, if you have a 6-year-old, it might be a little scary to hear that 20, 30 years later, there can still be challenges. That really, it often helps to just sort of be looking at the next week, the next month, the next year, but not quite so far down the road. And I'm actually going to pass this to Angela in a minute, because Angela and I are co-facilitating a group through Health Nexus grant for senior caregivers. And these are the people that had no supports. There was no FASD worker program, and they weren't coming to these groups anymore for that very reason. But we have people aged 55 to 85 that want to share with each other. Angela helps us by providing clinical support, but also just to learn from each other. It is so helpful for caregivers to mentor each other and have that peer-to-peer support. But I know, Angela, you've got much to add to that.
Yeah, well, no, you're doing a great job. But it does. The needs are very vast and they're very different. And I think that, we have limited resources, right? But the government has made a commitment to FASD workers. They have made a commitment to the support group project, which is really great. So most communities have access, especially now with COVID, online stuff. So it is really, really important that we do that, because everybody needs to have a place where they feel like they belong and that they're understood. But, and I do aim to, because there are limited resources, you do aim to be as inclusive as possible. But as Nancy said, there are some situations where, a person with brand new, little people with a new diagnosis, they don't want to be sharing their stories with somebody who's dealing with adolescence. I mean, that's just a very different thing. And our young and our older caregiver group, they just amaze me, because they've done all of this. Again, they still don't know they wouldn't even think about accessing things like community living even, right? And some of the supports that are out there, just because they weren't available to them. FASD was was not included, and it's still not included in DSO often, and it's not included sometimes in our mental health services either. You know, as recent as just a couple of years ago, because the funding for mental health comes from the Ministry of Health, funding for FASD comes from the Ministry of Children and Community and Social Services, so sometimes there's some barriers there as well. So but yeah, there's a need to be as specific as we can, and to make sure that people feel like they belong and supported.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that, Nancy and Angela. Janet or Rainier, do you have any additions to that, or if you need to think about it, that's fine too. We can. Oh, Janet.
Sure. Just to remind me about the question, it was about support, right?
Caregiver supports, yes.
Caregiver support, yeah. You know, it's absolutely a key piece. You know, as a caregiver myself, and yeah, my situation is quite unique because I am a caregiver of 2 children with FASD, but I'm also a clinician in this community. And so that's been a very tricky world for myself to navigate, because it's so hard to be in a support group setting when I know these families professionally. So there, something to consider within the communities is, it was initiated by another caregiver who is also a professional in this community, but we do have a support group just for us professionals who are also parents raising kids with FASD, so that we actually, you know, we may be colleagues, but we're also fellow parents. But we do not have clients in our group. So that's another thing to think about. But it's definitely a piece that I, when I am doing assessments and connecting with families, that I strongly encourage parents, caregivers, individuals to get connected with a peer. You need to know someone where you don't have to repeat your story over again, and they just understand what you're going through, because they're going through it too. And it's not that, yeah, it's that true being able to connect. It's so important.
If I can just add, the one thing that we did too when I was working at Health Nexus is we came up with guidelines for group facilitation, which I think are really, really important, because people who are experiencing FASD are quite unique in their needs, right? And so I think that, and you do have biological families, the family constellations are quite different, lots of kinship care arrangements, there's foster families and adoptive families. So I think all of those things, but with a good pre-group interview and making sure that people are group ready, because let's face it, we're all on this spectrum of assessment as well, if I may, right? Or acceptance, pardon me, when we do learn of the diagnosis. So sometimes it's too topical, it's too emotional. And I've seen situations where people do go to a group setting and maybe divulge more than what they're comfortable with. And then they walk away and there's concerns from the whole group members, and then they walk away going, why did I say all of that? I shared too much too soon. You know, so the facilitators need to be, kind of trained and understand what they're going to be experiencing within that setting as well, in order to be supportive as possible.
Rainier, I saw you put your hand up.
I did. It's kind of interesting because I feel like I'm at the opposite end of, I'm technically not a kid anymore, but there's I've been blessed in the last couple of years to meet adults on the spectrum, and it's totally important to me to meet, I want to support the young folks, but it's really important for my comfort to have that, like you say, to not have to repeat the story and all that. But the other thing, so I can kind of relate from the other end of the spectrum. But the other thing I think it's really important for caregivers, parents, anybody, when you're sharing stories like this, like you're right, you don't want to terrorize someone that, oh my gosh, I've got 20 years of this. I think it's so important to go, and it's important for me, example, to show the joys and the good things I've gotten from the spectrum. But for caregivers, I think it's so important that when you're sharing across platform or not the same stuff to the other side, read the room. You got to read the room. You've got to read, if I'm a person, I've got a real hyperactive kid, and all this is this set of behaviors I'm working with. Are they dealing with the same behavior? Like, is it reasonable to talk about that with them or not? So again, I think some people can get very enthusiastic in their desire to help. Let me educate you about this, but you really have to be in your heart at any time when you're sharing this stuff, because there are some really rocky roads here and some of them are all, not guaranteed, but some of them are pretty sure they'll pop up. But again, to go, is this the time they need to know this, or do they just need to know that, you know what, some people turn out really great, and here's some examples of.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, I think that's what I wanted to say.
And keep the hope.
Hope. That's actually the word I did. Yeah, hope. You have to keep hope in any conversation. Yeah.
Really good point. I just saw a question or comment here too that the support group project is for FASD, but I think it's important for everybody to know that you don't need a diagnosis in order to qualify. So if you suspect that there's been prenatal exposure to alcohol as a part of your history, then I would encourage you to connect with the FASD workers and the FASD support groups in your communities, because the needs that you're mentioning on the side here really do seem to look like they could be. And I think you would appreciate that.
And the link, Janet's put the links in the resources section for you to find your FASD worker and the Ontario support groups.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And so kind of similar to that note, there's a question that's come in that reads, when there are sufficient diagnostic domains but no history of alcohol, is the diagnosis consistent with FASD permissible?
Great question. I guess the part of clarification is that prenatal exposure to alcohol is suspected, but there's no confirmation, or do you absolutely know there's been no prenatal exposure to alcohol? Like, that's two very different questions. There have been a number of comparison charts that have looked at symptoms that overlap with various different disabilities. And there's a lot of overlap when you look at FASD. The one piece that's unique to FASD is that prenatal exposure to alcohol piece. Definitely recognizing that not all situations are you able to get that confirmation and get that confirmation easily. But if you know for sure that there has been zero prenatal exposure to alcohol, then no. The answer is no, it's not FASD. And so I hope that answers the question.
But the most important thing, I think, if we suspect that there's prenatal alcohol exposure, I think that the psychological and the OT and the speech and language assessments and the developmental histories, all of that coming together is still going to give a really good profile, right? And that's really what we want. Like I've often said, I don't really care if it's tomato soup or sour milk that caused the problem. But the bottom line is there's a problem. And we've got a really scattered learning profile, and with pockets of brilliance and pockets of real challenge. And so once you get that, you're going to get it. Now, and also the DSM allows for, complex neurodevelopmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So I would really encourage conversations with a psychologist to see whether or not those kinds of diagnoses can be made, because really that's what's the most important piece, that we know that there's a complicated and a complex neurodevelopmental disorder, not just mental health or not trauma and attachment, for example. Lots of times there's an overlap or mix up in that. So I hope that's helpful.
Great, thanks. So we have another two questions that came in. I'm going to try and tie them together. It's a little bit about prevention and education. So one person has written that I assume that with a lot of education among our young people about the dangers of alcohol, that the incidence of FASD would go down. Are there policies that you think would be good for us as a society to help prevent FASD? And kind of the second question that someone posted was about, providers who have to deal with, or have you been able to deal with providers who blame the mother? And how can we facilitate and foster more education about this? So I think they're a little bit different, but still a little bit related on when we think about prevention and promotion discussion. So. Angela, I see you're on.
Well, I've been in the business for a long time, and I've seen a lot of reasons why people drink, and none of which include to intentionally harm their growing babies. So I think that has to be just really understood. So, and I'm not afraid to tell whoever it is, whether there's a physician or anybody that has that bias, because that's just, it's not as simple. And policies are complicated too. I don't think we're in a position where we can really speak on that necessarily. Obviously, people have a right to informed decisions though. And we as service providers have the obligation to make sure that the information that we're offering is accurate. So we can't say to somebody who's 5 months along, stop drinking now, your baby will be fine. We can't say that, oh no, you don't have FASD, your baby's way too big, he's perfect. We can't say things like that in good conscience, knowing that we're not giving accurate information. And also, it's really interesting because I've been meeting with some people from our First Nations community, and there's so much culturally for the rest of us in mainstream, I suppose, we're really worried about asking that question about prenatal alcohol exposure. And the question or the comment from the elder that I was speaking to is just get trained, get comfortable with discomfort, because actually our families want us to ask about that. It's kind of patronizing to not, right? If we suspect it, we're not giving people credit to be able to handle some of these difficulties. And I think that's really important for all of us to remember. And FASD is in all of our circles, right? Personal and professional. It's everywhere, and it's indiscriminate. So the more we talk, the more we learn about those early weeks, where we're not aware of the pregnancy yet. The more we talk about planning pregnancies and 3 months ahead of time, eating and being as healthy as you possibly can, both partners or all parents, right? I think those conversations are going to keep going.
Okay, thanks, Angela. And so maybe in the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll actually invite each of you to perhaps provide, a quick closing remark. We've had such great discussion today, covered so many different topics. So feel free to share something that you really want the audience to take away after they leave this session. So maybe I'll start with Nancy.
Sure. I think the takeaway I hope everybody has is that we all have a role in this. So whether you are a service provider, if you're a young person thinking about getting pregnant, we all have a role to play in supporting healthy pregnancies, supporting people in those choices without judgment, but also supporting people with FASD, families. And I find often people want to be helpful, but they aren't quite sure how to be. So I just encourage you to not be afraid to ask questions and just say what would be helpful to you, what would be helpful to you in this moment. So, but really, we all have a role to play, and I am sure you know somebody with FASD, even if you don't realize it.
Thanks, Nancy. Angela?
I've been talking a lot, so I wonder if we should go to Janet first and,
Sure.
and Rainier, and then I can follow up if that's possible. Sorry.
So kind of last thoughts for me is what I have learned over the years. I started off in the FASD world purely as a clinician, thinking I knew everything. And then now as a parent, and one of the things that I wish I knew, 15 years ago is, yes, there are difficulties. Yes, there are challenges. We have 10 brain domains that we're looking at when we're doing an assessment, but we can't forget just the beauty and the strengths in these young people in their lives. And as much as you can, I'm going to give Rainier as an example, but surround yourself with examples of people with FASD who you can look up to and act as mentors for your young people too. And it has been such a gift to my family that my boys have been able to meet Rainier. And so that's one of the things, is just look at the strengths. There's so many strengths there. They're hidden under those emotional moments or those challenging moments, but they're there, and keep looking for them and help our kids to see those strengths too. Because when we, as Dr. Rick Hansen says, our brains are like Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good. Let's flood these kids with so many good experiences and help them see that they've got strengths and so much to offer.
Okay, Rainier and then Angela.
Oof. Oh, Janet, I do love you guys. I guess the biggest thing for me, and this has been from the beginning for me, this is part of my advocacy, is, is there's times where it can feel, you can, as a caregiver and a parent, I know this from being really able to relate to my parents before they passed, you can go absolutely batch crazy, going, your feelings, anger, frustration, everything, because you just can't control folks on the spectrum, and they don't know how to control themselves. But don't worry so much about what you're thinking all the time. Always notice what you're feeling. Your heart is the thing that will be the transmission point for hope. You can talk hope, but kids can feel when you're shaky and you're scared and you're crap talking just words. Find that place, when you're dealing with anybody on the spectrum, to find that place in your heart that does have that ability to see them and have the ability for hope in there, because they will feel your hopelessness, and that is a horrible, horrible thing to bring into the room. So that would be my biggest thing, is always touch that place in yourself that does have hope. And whether you look to someone like me or there are some of us out there who have gotten quite a ways along, and I've met some just amazing adults on this. But I agree with Janet, even if it's not for your kids, but for yourself, touch hope in your heart before you deal with your kids or anyone else's kids for that matter. Because to come in with just empty platitudes, and sometimes that's all you got, I get it, but that's my advocacy, is dig in deeper for your heart, because that's the magic thing that will help you get to the magic good things that people on this spectrum have. So I'll say that.
And for me, again, you're a hard one to follow. I think you summed it up beautifully. I think hope is really, really important. I think it's really important to know that FASD is in all of our circles. I think that as service providers, we need to understand that the prevalence rates of 4% is for the general population. By the time they come to see us, it's way higher than that. So it is really our responsibility. This is a human rights issue as far as I'm concerned, that all persons with all types of disabilities must enjoy the same human rights as everyone. And so we don't get to choose, oh, I don't know enough about that, it's not my job. Well, it is our job, because they're part of our job descriptions, whether we recognize it or not. And so many people have FASD. The research we have are on the ones that we notice, right, that have had the wherewithal and understanding to get access to a diagnosis. But there's so many out there that are living alone, that are just bouncing off of guideposts, I say it, and staying okay, but they're struggling, and they're struggling unnecessarily, and we can support them and wrap around them differently.
Right. Thank you so much to all of you for such a wonderful discussion this afternoon. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and there's just such a wealth of positive comments coming in. Just so much hope was created in this session. I think that's a big takeaway for me. So thank you again, Nancy, Janet, Rainier, and Angela, for spending a Friday afternoon with us. And thank you to everyone who also is listening and stayed with us just a little past 5 as well. A quick reminder to say that we will be sharing a session evaluation shortly. We do hope that you fill it out, as your feedback is really helpful to our conference planning and will inform future sessions. So please do fill that out. And as we mentioned at the beginning, you will receive the recording and slide deck, which has all the resources that our lovely speakers spoke about today. And so I think on that note, I will say thank you again to everyone, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. There's some lovely comments there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.